Hi, this is Corey Johnston, and today's lesson is going to be a prequel of a previous lesson from Matthew's 24th chapter. We took it from verse 23 all the way to the end. We're going to be covering the material which occurs before that, the first half of that. But before we do that, we just want to establish the chronology. This discourse, Mount Olivet Discourse, took place during the final week of the Savior's life. So on Sunday, we witness his triumphant entry into Jerusalem, fulfilling the prophecy of Zechariah on a donkey. This is Palm Sunday, when he is greeted and heavily acclaimed in the city which welcomes him. And we can read of this in the 21st chapter, verses 1 through 11. Then on Monday, we read of the clearing of the temple when he is repulsed by the presence of men of Mammon who have set up shop, desecrating and defiling and corrupting his father's temple. He took this very personally. And the synoptic authors record this in the third year of his ministry. John records it in the first, and to prepare you for any skeptic who challenges the validity to reconcile the discrepancy, you can tell them that there's no discrepancy to reconcile. Both happened. Tuesday, we read of parables and discourses. There's a lot of material here, beginning in the 22nd or 23rd verse of the 21st chapter. He gives an object lesson of a fig tree, which he pronounces woe on and uses a symbolic allusion to. Then his authority is questioned. Then we read of the parables of the two sons, then the parables of the tenants. We don't have time to elaborate on each of these. We just want to outline the order in which they are presented. Then in the 22nd chapter, we read of the parable of the wedding banquet. Then he's asked a question of paying taxes to Caesar, and it is the Pharisees who ask this question in an attempt to trap him. Then marriage at the resurrection is the questions of marriage at the resurrection are posed by the Sadducees, who didn't even believe in the resurrection. So they were just trying to trip him up and trap him up again. Then the Pharisees and Sadducees combine to conspire to ask him what the greatest commandment is, and he answers this with two passages from the Old Testament. Deuteronomy 6:5, love Yahweh thy Elohim with all thy might, all thy mind, all thy strength, all thy faculties, and all their capacities. And Leviticus 19:18, love thy neighbor as thyself. And then he answers, whose son is he? And then in the preceding chapter, he's addressing his disciples. He's in the temple, and he's issuing an indictment and exposing the hypocrisy and character of the Pharisees, upon whom he pronounces 8 woes on. We're going to read each one and briefly comment on it. Verse 13, but woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, because you shut up the kingdom of the heavens before men. You do not go in, nor do you allow those who are entering to go in. So they are hypocritical. That's the vice which pays virtue homage. So they had a veneer of artificial external righteousness, but they are in fact hindering and posing an obstacle to the ones who they taught and influenced to the kingdom of heaven, which is the very purpose for rabbinical rabbis. The Pharisees were dominant at the local synagogue level, so they anyone who followed them, they were blind leading the blind in Matthew 15:14. Next verse, woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, because you eat up widows' houses and for a show make long prayers. Because of this you shall receive greater judgment. So once more he establishes their hypocritical character and elaborates on that statement by saying that they took advantage of the vulnerable, the widows, and just for show they made a pretense of long public prayer. He addresses how to do this without being a hypocrite in the 6th chapter. There's 3 practices: almsgiving, prayers, and fasting. And the Pharisees were showboats, they were publicity hounds, and they did it all for show. And because they were entrusted to the responsibility, they would demand greater accountability. And so it's a responsibility we cannot take lightly when we are entrusted to spiritual authority. Verse 15, woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, because you go about the land and the sea to win one convert, and when he is won, you make him a son of gay Hymen, twofold more than yourselves. So this parallels what we read in the 13th verse. They weren't doing their job. They went through extraordinary lengths and efforts to win one convert, but they were turning him over to hell, which was their own destination. So if you follow false teachers, you follow their doom and destination. Verse 16, woe to you, blind guides, who say, whoever swears by the temple, it does not matter, but whoever swears by the gold of the temple is bound by the oath. So the blind guides brings us back to chapter 15, verse 14. And they had their priorities all out of whack. They prioritized the gold in the temple, the earthly material wealth, rather than the spiritual treasures of the temple. Verse 23, woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, because you tithe the mint and the anise and cumin, and have neglected the weightier of the Torah, the judgments, and the mercy and justice, and the compassion and the faith. These need have been done without neglecting the others. So once more, he accuses them of having their priorities way out of whack, way out of order. They were obsessed with the mechanical minutia of the ritualistic religion, but they neglected what really matters, and that's judgment, justice, mercy, faith, etc. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, because you clean the outside of the cup and dish, but inside they are filled with plunder and unrighteousness. So the Pharisees had an external, artificial righteousness. They were carefully concealed the sins of the flesh, but they were guilty of the sins of the spirit. They harbored hatred in their hearts for the masses, the unclean masses who did not share their obsession or knowledge with the cleansing rituals, the physical cleansing rituals of the Mosaic Law. Verse 27, woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, because you are like whitewashed tombs, which outwardly indeed look well, but inside are filled with dead man's bones and all uncleanness. So, lurking subterranean beneath the shiny surface was a tomb. So they had a whitewashed tomb, which was a aesthetically pleasing presentation, but inside dwelled the dead. So they were sources of spiritual death, and they had no spiritual vitality to their message or practices. Final one, verse 29, woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, because you build the tombs of the prophets and decorate the monuments of the righteous, and say, if we lived in the days of our fathers, we would not have taken part with them in the blood of the prophets. But he identifies them as the heirs of the ones who had slayed the prophets, and sure enough, by the end of the week, they would slay him, because on Wednesday comes the day of rest, on Thursday is the Last Supper, and on Friday is the crucifixion. And the Mount Olivet Discourse, the 24th and 25th chapter represents the fifth and final extensive discourse. These are discourses in which the master is almost exclusively speaking, so he's not teaching. There's no dialogue element. The first of which is the Sermon on the Mount, which spans the range of the 5th through 7th chapter. It's the longest recorded sermon in Scripture. Then in the commissioning of the 12 in the 10th chapter, then the 8 parables of the 13th chapter, and then in the 18th chapter, where among other things he recites the parables of the lost sheep and the unmerciful servant. Now we're going to get to the chapter itself, opening verse. And going out, Joshua went away from the temple, and his disciples came near to him to point out to him the buildings of the temple. So he was teaching in the temple, and this comes up at his trial and his trial before the Sanhedrin. He says, I was teaching in the temple all this week, and yet you did not arrest me. When they come to him in Gethsemane, he says, you come with armed clubs and armed men, like I am a robber or a thief or a violent man. But I was teaching in the temple, and everything I have to say is out in the open. There's no secret message. I'm completely transparent. And the disciples, being Jews, they point with pride to the building of the temple. The temple would have been rebuilt during the days of Ezra, or slightly before 515, and would have been elaborated on extensively by Herod the Great, who added a lot of additions and improvements and expansions to it. And Joshua said to them, do you not see all these? Truly I say to you, not one stone shall be left here upon another at all, which shall not be thrown down. So he's offering a future prediction, but he doesn't give the timeline, and most of the disciples would live to witness this, or at least, a lot of them would. 70 AD, I think Peter died in 66 A.D., but Matthew certainly would have been around. He wrote this after the temple. Most scholars believe the destruction of the temple, which took place as predicted, not when predicted, in 70 A.D., not long after this. So the Mount Olivet Discourse has an immediate prophecy and an end times fulfillment. So one of the things I try to do, encourage others to do when reading and dissecting and analyzing biblical prophecy, is always look for the echo. There's seldom one fulfillment or one way that prophecy is fulfilled. And as he sat on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him separately, saying, "Say to us, when shall this be? And what is the sign of your coming and of the end of the world?" Now, the Mount of Olives was a mile-long ridge beyond the Kidron Valley. It was east of Jerusalem, some 200 feet in elevation above the city. And Mark records his version of this discourse in the 13th chapter in the book which bears his name. Luke does the same in the 21st, but Matthew's is the most extensive and detailed and descriptive. And the disciples seem to think that the temple, the destruction of the temple, would be closely connected to his coming. And of course, they were wrong, but they had led to believe. And the coming, the Greek word parousia indicates coming or appearance or manifestation. This is the second coming. So they're aware of the fact that he is destined to die. He is en route, and he's not going to live out the week. And the end of the age pertains to end times. And Yahshua answered, said to them, "Take heed that no one leads you astray." So this marks the sermon. After this point, it's only him speaking, so it goes all the way to the 25th chapter. And the events described in verses 4 through 8 are not at the end, but prior to the end. So the first thing he conditions warns them that they have the potentiality to be led astray. "For many shall come in my name, saying, I am Messiah, and they shall lead many astray." So messianic pretenders and imposters were a fact of life. They were especially prolific in the interim between the crucifixion of the Messiah and the destruction of the temple. Josephus, the famed Jewish historian, records many of these variants from the years 30 through 70 A.D., and there were even some as late as 132. But there's also going to be an end-time people who are going to be claiming to be the Messiah. They're going to be false. And there's a plurality as we read eventually, perhaps not in the section we'll be covering today. So this is distinct from the anti-Messiah, the singular tense, the end-time global dictator. "And you shall begin to hear of fightings and reports of fightings. See that you are not troubled, for these have to take place, but the end is not yet." So wars and rumors of wars, and at least as early as the Cold War, the rumor and threat and potentiality of war was an effective instrument, equally as effective as war itself. At the speaking of this, we are rumored to be heading into a war with Iran. But these all have to take place. There has to be geopolitical turmoil. That's a necessary precondition to establish the end. There's going to be geopolitical turmoil. There's going to be abnormal natural activity, supernaturally induced, as we'll get to. "For nation shall rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom, and there shall be famines of food, and deadly diseases, and earthquakes in places." So the geopolitical turmoil and tension is going to be supplemented simultaneously by famine and earthquakes. And the acceleration of natural disasters, I think we've had more earthquakes since the year 1700 since then than we have in all human history. So this is literally unfolding in our eyes. The warnings we have to heed them today because his coming is right around the corner. I can hear his footsteps. And all these are the beginning of birth pains. Birth pains, they're not pleasant, but they're necessary. So when a woman gives a birth in John 16:21, all the sorrow, all the pain, all the anguish of that physically taxing ordeal is instantly eliminated by the birth of the child. Once they hold them in their hands, their pain is instantly forgetting about. So this has to come to pass, and it too shall pass. It's going to be painful. It's not going to be pleasant, but it's not going to be permanent. It's not going to be eternal. These are the necessary temporal persecutions and pains that have to give way in order for us to lay claim of that which is eternal and awaits us. Then they shall deliver you up to affliction and kill you, and you shall be hated by all nations for my name's sake. Now, the Roman historian Tacitus described Christians as the hated ones of mankind, and the reason that we are so hated and feared is because the world does not understand us, and it is a established fact that one fears what they do not understand. They do not understand our mores. They do not understand our ethics. They do not understand our values. They do not understand why we are willing to turn the cheek and would sooner endure abuse and exploitation than inflict it or retaliated on it. But this has to come to pass. They're going to be hated by all nations, and for his name's sake, not for their own sake. I think there's a dangerous ground when Christians give themselves license to be jerks and they insist they're being persecuted for his name's sake, when in actual fact they're just being persecuted for their own sake, their own ego, their own ambition, their own pride. And then many shall stumble, and they shall deliver you up one another, and they shall hate one another. So the Apostle Paul speaks of a falling away, and this is connected to the deception we read of in the 24th verse of this chapter that lays outside the range we'll be covering today. But there's a division between them and among them, so many who were once faithful will betray and turn on each other, and once they renounce their faith, the ones they once considered loved and their brethren will be hated as enemies. So there's going to be a division within the house and a destructive division within the house of God. And many false prophets shall rise up and lead many astray. So false prophets are nothing new. They've been an established presence in Jewish history. They've been an established presence in Christian history, and they are not limited to Christendom alone. Many false prophets belong to the environmental movement who predict their version of an apocalypse, and they lead many astray. All these predictions have been repeatedly invalidated, yet they keep at it. They keep giving the earth and the planet another 12-year shelf life, or just to mention the most recent one, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, the satanically stupid demagogue, unprincipled demagogue we all love and admire, and Al Gore. According to him, the polar ice caps already melted some 6 years ago, but they're still here. And because of the increase in lawlessness, the love of many shall become cold. So where there is law, there is love. Where there is lawlessness, there is a lack of love. And to be cold is the neutral territory. I believe one of the churches addressed in the book of Revelation in the first 3 chapters 2 and 3, is accused of being lukewarm, and they have been vomited out. But cold is worse than being lukewarm. It just means you are frigid, you are unmoved, unfazed by the preaching of the good news message. You can goes in one ear, out the other, and it doesn't even bother you, doesn't even prick your conscience, and that's going to be one of the consequences and conditions of the increase in lawlessness. So the geopolitical turmoil is going to reduce a lot of nations to borderline anarchy, and this is when the anti-Messiah steps in to reestablish law and order and peace across the earth, and then he's going to release the tribulation, the severest suffering of Christians in any time in human history. But he who shall have endured to the end shall be saved. So therein we learn that endurance and patience is necessary prerequisite for salvation. There is no such thing as once saved, always saved. Salvation is not so simple as getting on your knees once. You have to endure with the integrity of your initial born-again confession intact. And endurance is a verb. It does not mean passively waiting for the providential promises to come. There are 4 aspects of enduring till the end. Waiting, this demands patience. Witnessing, the gospel has to go across the continents, across the age before these come to pass. Working, and so we have to stay busy in bringing the kingdom rather than relying on the promise of the kingdom to come. We have to bring what we can of the kingdom before its literal fulfillment. And watching, witnessing, working, waiting. You know what? I only covered 3 out of 4. I'm just gonna move on. And this good news of the kingdom shall be proclaimed in all the world as a witness to all the nations, and then the end shall come. So before the end comes to pass, this message, this good news, has to be spread to all the world, all the nations, all the people in those nations. So we're not quite there yet. We haven't really made we're on the retreat in the Muslim world. Specifically, at the dawn of the previous century, Christians represented 20% of the population in the Middle East. We have since then been literally decimated to a mere pittance, a 2% presence, and we are on the endangered species in there. But the good news has to be proclaimed and reproclaimed in the places it's already been proclaimed. So when you see the abomination that lays waste, spoken of by Daniel the prophet, put up in the temple, he who reads, let him understand. So the abomination of Daniel, there are 3 fulfillments of this, the first of which came in the year 168 BM before Messiah. The Macedonian Seleucid Emperor Antiochus Epiphanes, who Daniel references, though not by name, in Daniel 11:21 through 45, and he is also in the Deuterocanonical books of the Maccabees. He slaughtered pigs, the filthiest animal according to Jewish dietary law, on the altar in the temple and offered them up to Zeus. This was a desecration and a defilement and an abomination. And also in the year 70 AD, the temple would be ransacked and destroyed by the future Roman Emperor Titus, the son of the current Roman Emperor Vespasian. And his younger brother Domitian was a persecutor of Christians who sent John to the Isle of Patmos, where he recorded Revelation as a prisoner. And then the third one is the setting up of the image of the anti-Messiah in the temple. The temple will be rebuilt. This may or may not come. Most likely you and I will live to see it. And the image will be firmly fixed and placed in the temple. We can read of this in 2 Thessalonians 2:4 and also Revelation 13:14 and 15. Then let those who are in Judah flee to the mountains. This did come to pass. The mountains would have been the Transjordanic mountains. These were the closest mountains to Judah, and this did come to pass. Many Jewish Christians did flee when Titus came in and brutally suppressed the Zealot-inspired rebellion. They fled to those mountains. And let him who is on his housetop not come down and take whatever out of his house. And let him who is in the field not turn back to get his garments. And woe to those who are pregnant and to those who are nursing children in those days. And pray that your flight does not take place in winter or on the Sabbath. Now this, beginning in verse 15, this is unique to Matthew's version. Remember, he has the most descriptive and detailed Mount Olivet discourse, and he's writing primarily to a Jewish audience, so the Sabbath, according to it, no obedient Jew could travel more than a mile and a half. I think that was a Sabbath day journey then, and winter, there would have been the water. The winter swelled the waters of the Jordan River, making it extremely difficult to cross. So, but also all this stuff, that comes before it. Woe unto those who are pregnant and those who are nursing children in those days. So that's going to be a hindrance and an unwanted distraction to fulfilling the fleeing obligations which need to be done, because if you're carrying a child in your arms, you're not going to get away, but it's going to be inescapable and unavoidable. For there shall be great distress, such as has not been since the beginning of the world until this time. No, nor ever shall be. This is in reference to the tribulation, so the anti-Messiah is going to rule over the earth for 7 years. In the 3.5-year turning point, it's gonna mark a transition from the peacemaker to the tyrant. His true colors and masks, he's going to be unmasked and exposed for who he truly is, an agent of the adversary. So named the anti-Messiah because he is axiomatically aligned with everything that is against or opposite. the Messiah, and as the Messiah himself references, this period of severe distress, great distress, tribulation. It's going to be unprecedented and unduplicated. The world's never seen anything like it, nor will it ever again. And it's going to be to such a severe extent as to dwarf all the historical persecutions of Christians that have come. The book of Revelation speaks that many martyrs will pay the price with their heads for their confession of the faith. And so it's not going to be pleasant, but it's the martyrs are sealed in their salvation. And if those days were not shortened, no flesh would be saved. But for the sake of those chosen ones, those days shall be shortened. So there's a definite mark, a designated time which this come to pass. It's all temporary. I know when suffering takes place in the moment, it's so extreme and so isolating, and all you can think about is what's happening to me. But there's a reason that a limitation is imposed on the duration this is because he doesn't want to compromise the saved status of the chosen or elect ones. So it is for their sake that the days shall be shortened, and for that we have cause to be grateful. Whether or not we witness to live in it, we should at all times be prepared for the end times, and I hope that's the one of the reasons you're here. That's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much. I'm so glad to see you. Stay tuned until next time. I'll see you then. Bye-bye.